economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
No one expected this to happen right now. The northern border of the United States with Canada, a place that for decades was considered the most peaceful, safe and stable, has suddenly become the scene of the biggest political and diplomatic crisis in recent years. After FBI Director Kash Patel's sensational statements about a sharp increase in the number of suspected terrorists crossing the border from Canada, President Donald Trump did what no American leader in modern history had dared to do. He ordered the northern border to be effectively closed.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The official explanation sounds simple: national security. But what is really happening is much deeper and more dangerous. Trump claims that the enemies have adapted and are now coming through Canada rather than Mexico. According to him, while the southern border has been fortified to the limit, the northern border has been neglected, and that is where the new wave of threats has shifted. These statements came immediately after the publication of alarming data. In recent months, more than 250 people associated with extremist organizations have attempted to enter the US via Canada. And although the southern border remains busier, the very fact of the shift in migration has caused panic in Washington.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
But there is another side to this story. While the White House talks about security, critics see political calculations at work. Hundreds of military units and National Guard personnel have already been sent to northern border crossings. Crossings have been partially frozen, checks have been tightened, and the economies of both countries are beginning to feel the pressure. Every day, billions of dollars in goods and services cross this border, and now that entire flow is under threat. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney makes no secret of his indignation. His government claims that Trump's decision was made without consultation or agreement, that this is not protection, but a show of force, and that America, under the guise of fighting terrorism, is dragging Canada into its own internal games. Ottawa is talking about a diplomatic shock. An ally that has been considered a reliable partner for decades has suddenly become a source of instability. There are protests in the streets and emergency meetings in Parliament. While Washington declares that security comes first, Canadian experts warn that even a short-term border closure could destroy thousands of jobs, collapse exports, and sow mistrust for years to come.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
All this is happening against the backdrop of a growing flow of migrants seeking to enter Canada from the U.S. people who, until recently, were trying to remain on American soil. Now they are fleeing north to escape the new immigration rules. What is really behind Donald Trump's decision? A real threat or political theater ahead of the elections? Why did Canada learn about the border closure from the news rather than through diplomatic channels? And most importantly, will this permanently change the relationship between two countries that have called each other friends for decades? The United States of America is once again at the center of a political storm. It all started with a brief, seemingly insignificant statement by FBI Elector Kash Patel during a routine congressional hearing. He spoke calmly, but his words instantly exploded across the news feeds. The number of known or suspected terrorists attempting to enter the US via Canada had risen sharply. At the same time, the flow across the southern border, which for many years had been considered the main source of threat, had, on the contrary, decreased. The figures cited by Patel were alarming: more than 250 attempts to illegally cross the northern border since the beginning of the year. But what was even more alarming was how he said it without details, without context, as if leaving room for speculation.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
In Washington, this caused a bombshell effect. The media picked up on the topic. Analysts started talking about a new front in the north, and the White House began preparing reports on the state of border security with Canada that very same day. According to sources close to the intelligence community, even before Patel's statement, the special services had indeed recorded strange travel routes of individuals previously seen in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Some of them were spotted in Montreal and Ottawa, where they allegedly used fake documents to travel to the United States. This information has not been officially confirmed, but it is likely that it formed the basis of the alarming report referred to by Patel. Traditionally, the attention of U.S. law enforcement agencies has been focused on the South, where thousands of kilometers of walls stretch and where debates about migrants and drug trafficking have been raging for many years. The North, on the other hand, was perceived almost as a symbol of tranquility. No deserts, no cartels, no mass crossings. Quiet forests, clear lakes, punctual border guards. But behind this idyllic picture lay a problem that few people talked about. The control system on the northern border remained technologically outdated. Surveillance cameras installed 10 years ago were barely working, drones were breaking down, and some areas simply lacked personnel. According to the Department of Homeland Security, only 68% of the territory along the border with Canada was actually controlled. The rest was kilometers of forest trails that could be traversed on foot without encountering a single patrol.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
When Patel's statement became public, it was instantly picked up by Donald Trump's supporters. The former president, known for his tough stance on immigration and national security, did not miss the opportunity. Just hours after an excerpt from the hearing was broadcast on Fox News and Newsmax, he wrote on Truth Social, "America has ignored the threat from the North for too long. That will change. I will do what a leader must do, protect our citizens, whatever border it may be." This post was a call to action. According to journalists, the White House meeting lasted more than 5 hours. Trump listened to representatives of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Pentagon, and international affairs advisors. Most of the speakers suggested limiting themselves to strengthening controls, more patrols, more cameras, intelligence sharing with Canada. But Trump, as was often the case, decided to go further. He demanded that a comprehensive plan to close the northern border be prepared, a step that no president in modern U.S. history had ever taken.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The official explanation was crystal clear: to prevent the infiltration of terrorists and illegal immigrants. But behind the scenes, there was talk of something else. Trump's entourage had long believed that the issue of security was the best way to regain the attention of the electorate. After several months of calm and criticism from his opponents, he needed something loud that would once again show him as a man of action. The decision to close the border with Canada was just such a step. 3 days after Patel's hearing, in the morning hours, the White House issued a statement. The U.S. is temporarily suspending the operation of a number of border crossings in the north, strengthening controls at major crossings, and introducing additional checks for all vehicles coming from Canada. In addition, National Guard units from Vermont, Minnesota, and Michigan were sent to the border. For Americans, accustomed to thinking of the northern border as an open door, this came as a shock. Traffic jams began at the checkpoints. Truck drivers reported delays of up to 12 hours. Tourists heading to Montreal or Toronto turned back. For the first time in decades, images of military vehicles at the bridge in Niagara Falls appeared in the media. The atmosphere at the border began to resemble scenes from the South, where concrete, barbed wire, and document checks have become a familiar part of the landscape.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Officials claimed that the measures were temporary. However, anonymous sources in the Department of Homeland Security told reporters that the temporary measures could last for months and possibly longer. Moreover, there was discussion within the department about the possibility of installing temporary engineering barriers at the most vulnerable sections, essentially the beginning of the construction of a wall, only now in the north. To reinforce the effect, articles appeared in the American press mentioning allegedly intercepted communications in which extremists discussed routes through Canada. One of the reports cited CIA sources claiming that there was a sleeper cell of an international terrorist network in Montreal that was in contact with groups in Europe. None of these facts were publicly confirmed, but the information background had already done its job. Fear and anxiety swept through society.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Trump's approval rating among Republican Party supporters rose by 7 points in a week. People saw him as a decisive leader, ready to close even a symbolically friendly border if necessary for security. Critics, on the other hand, called it security theater, arguing that there was no real evidence of a threat and that the president's actions only complicated relations with his closest ally. Meanwhile, the first reactions began to come in from Canada. Canadian carriers reported millions in losses due to downtime. Trade associations warned that if the blockade lasted for even 2 weeks, the consequences for supply chains would be catastrophic. But in Washington, this did not deter anyone. For Trump, one thing was important: to show that America would not repeat the mistakes of the past. In closed meetings, the president, according to witnesses, repeated, "We will not wait for something to happen. We will not allow our enemies to use Canada as a backdoor." He recalled the terrorist attacks of past decades, the failures of intelligence, and the political weakness of previous administrations. This argument worked flawlessly. Fear is the best tool for strengthening power.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
And although officially the decision to partially close the border looked like a precautionary measure, in fact it was a show of force. Army helicopters patrolled areas of Michigan and North Dakota, and in some border towns, local residents saw checkpoints for the first time in their lives. Television footage of flags flying against the backdrop of armored vehicles created the impression that America was preparing not for defense, but for actual war. Thus, in just a few days, a quiet statement by an official grew into a storm that changed the perception of the northern border forever. Trump turned the FBI's bureaucratic concern into a loud political statement, making it a symbol of determination and strength. And although many understood that behind this decision lay not only concern for security, but also cold political calculation, the effect was achieved. The country was once again discussing borders, threats, and the need for tough measures. The North, which until recently had been considered peaceful and safe, suddenly became an arena of struggle, not only for control of the territory, but also for the minds of voters.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
After the decision to partially close the northern border came into force, the consequences began to be felt within a few days. Kilometre-long queues formed at checkpoints, and military vehicles with American flags appeared along forest roads where patrols had previously been only sporadic. All this was happening against the backdrop of a new phenomenon that Washington initially underestimated: the rapid growth in the number of migrants moving not south, as before, but north. People who had recently been trying to stay in the United States were now fleeing to Canada to escape new immigration restrictions. This movement proved so powerful that within weeks it turned into a massive flow, which became an argument in favor of tough measures. According to the Canadian Border Services Agency, more than 5,000 asylum applications were recorded in 2 months at just one crossing point, St. Bernard de la Colle, near Montreal. By comparison, a year ago, there There were fewer than 2,000 such applications during the same period. At first glance, the figure did not seem critical, but the problem was that this route was being used by people leaving the United States after the cancellation of temporary residence permits and the winding down of humanitarian programs. Among them were not only migrants from Central America, but also families from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East who found themselves in limbo due to the tightening of US policy. When the Canadian authorities realized the scale of what was happening, it became clear that the National Refugee Reception System was overwhelmed. Temporary accommodation centers were overflowing, and Quebec hotels began to house families awaiting the consideration of their cases. Canadian television channels showed reports of people sleeping at bus stations, and photos of columns of migrants walking along forest trails were circulating on social media. Some of these images turned out to be fake, taken on another continent, but they had a powerful effect. The public began to worry, and political opponents of Prime Minister Mark Carney accused him of the government losing control of the border. At the same time, signals began to come from Washington that it was the Canadian side that was to blame for the uncontrolled flow. American officials claimed that Ottawa had deliberately relaxed border controls to allow migrants to leave the US without causing a fuss. Canadian authorities called this accusation absurd, but Trump used the situation in his speeches. At one rally, he said that instead of cooperating, Canada is turning into a transit point for illegal immigrants and possible terrorists. These words were another drop in the growing crisis. Relations between the two countries began to deteriorate rapidly. The Canadian ministers of Trade and Foreign Affairs tried to arrange emergency talks, but Washington was slow to respond. Diplomatic circles said that the US administration was deliberately delaying contact in order to show who was dictating the terms. Carney, known for his restraint, allowed himself to use harsh language for the first time. He called Trump's decision an irresponsible act that strikes a blow to millions of ordinary people on both sides of the border. His words were broadcast on all major television channels, and the next day, rallies were held outside the Parliament building in Ottawa, with signs reading "Hands off our border" and "We are not a tool of American politics."
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
But behind the emotional reaction lay economic panic. Every day, goods and services worth about $2 billion crossed the border. Even minor delays could lead to production lines coming to a halt. In Windsor, car factories began to experience interruptions in the supply of parts from Detroit. Farmers in Saskatchewan complained that American trucks carrying seeds and fertilizers were stuck at customs, and meat processing plants in Vermont reported a shortage of raw materials. One of the largest chain retailers said that within a week there could be a shortage of certain products, especially fresh vegetables. The business community in both countries demanded immediate intervention. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a statement warning of irreversible damage to cross-border ties if the situation was not resolved. But the White House stood its ground. Within the administration, there was a belief that economic pressure would only amplify the effect. The louder the discontent, the stronger the president would appear, unafraid to go against the system. This was the paradox of the situation. For Trump, political victory lay not in stabilizing relations, but in demonstrating that he was capable of forcing even his closest allies to respect his decisions. In Canada, the crisis became an internal test for Carney. His opponents in Parliament argued that the Prime Minister was too soft, that he had failed to anticipate Trump's moves and had not defended national interests. The government's approval rating began to fall, and independent analysts noted that for the first time in decades, Canadians' trust in the United States had fallen to a record low. In polls, more than half of respondents said they considered the US an unreliable partner, and a third of those surveyed supported the idea of reducing military cooperation within NATO. Meanwhile, irritation was growing in the border provinces. Local residents, accustomed to daily trips across the border to work, to shop, to visit relatives, found themselves effectively cut off. Local newspapers published stories of families separated by the new rules. The crisis hit small towns particularly hard, where the economy depended on tourist and transit traffic. In Niagara Falls, restaurants and hotels began to close one after another, and business owners complained that the city is dying. In response to criticism from Ottawa, Trump issued a statement accusing the Canadian government of hysteria and attempting to cover up its own mistakes. He emphasized that America's security is not negotiable and that any losses are temporary. Nevertheless, behind the scenes, the State Department was already preparing analytical notes on the consequences for trade and tourism. Some diplomats warned that a prolonged standoff could turn into a real trade conflict if Canada decided to introduce retaliatory measures,